Were you destined to become a lawyer? Was there any question you were not going to be a lawyer?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. When I first went away, okay, I graduated from high school. My dad, the war was on, and my dad said, you know, you really ought to get yourself into college before the draft gets you. And he said, there's something about when you go into the service, if you are a college man, it's going to make a big difference in your career.
Mhm.
And so I put on the steam, and I graduated from high school in January of 1945.
Mhm.
And I went to Yale. And at that time, out of, I guess, 12 colleges that they had up there were 3 of them open, primarily 4Fs. And of course, most of it, was V12 and it was service.
Right.
So I started up there, and what did I take? Pre-engineering. I was going to be an engineer. I always liked to build things,
Yeah.
When I was a kid, I built a little racing car with a motor in it. And in those days, up in Broadview where we were, there were no cars or anything. And I used as a kid sail around in that little car all the time. And so I was not always destined to be a lawyer.
Yeah.
When I went in the Navy in the Korean War, I was halfway through law school at that time, and of course then I tried cases and did all of that kind of stuff on our ship. I was a legal officer, and to be honest with you, I didn't really particularly like that.
Yeah.
Once, I was a supply officer in the Navy, and I was a glorified bookkeeper, and I really did enjoy that type of thing. And I think I could have been a CPA and been just as happy as
Yeah.
being a lawyer. But that's why I got into the States, because I liked that type of thing. I mean, other people, they'd say, oh, geez, the accountings in our office, they go over in the corner, and it's the last thing we work on. And I loved to do accountings. I just thought that was neat. I liked that kind of working with numbers, But, no, I certainly wasn't always destined to be a lawyer.
How'd your dad get involved in it?
How'd my dad get involved in it? I don't know. I remember my grandmother saying from the time he could talk, he said he wanted to be a lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
But my dad grew up as a poor kid, really poor kid. He lived on Valley Street, which is behind the old bakery down on the corner of 8th and Main.
Okay, right.
And then they moved, he was born in Bradford, and then they moved from there over to 807 Cherry Street. And that's right in the heart of the Black District today. He lived in the YMCA, my dad did.
Okay.
Just spent all his time as a kid in the YMCA. And went away to school, went to the University of Pittsburgh because they had a work program down there. And he got no help from home. Went down to Pittsburgh and became a night bellhop in the Fort Pitt Hotel.
Yeah, be darned.
So he worked nights and went to school in the daytime. And then when he went in the service, he went in the Army, and he was stationed down in New York City, and he taught shorthand part-time to make money. And then he came back, after the Army, he came back, and he decided he'd go to Pitt Law School, but he only had 1 year of law school. That's all he ever had. And he came back home, and he studied under Louis Thrasher, who was an old-time lawyer in town.
Mm-hmm.
And private study. He got married, and I think my brother Bob was born along about that time. And he worked under Louis Thrasher and took his bar exam. And I think total school, both undergraduate and law school, was less than 3 years that he had. But that's what they did in those days. They took it under private study. And I can remember him telling about how my mother called him one day and said there was a letter there from the court system, and he said, well, open it up. This is when he found out he passed the bar exam. And she said, well, it says that you passed. And he said, well, which half? And she said, because in those days they could take both procedure, they could take a procedure part and they could take a substantive law part and pass half and then go on and take the other half. And he said, and I can remember him telling him this, she said, it doesn't say anything about halves. And so it was a great surprise to him that he passed. It was the first time he took a crack at it, and he had very little formal training.
Wonderful.
But he was, my dad had the most organized mind I've ever seen. He was a guy that, and I was fortunate enough to be able to practice it with him for a while. I started practicing in '54 and he died in '65, so I spent some time with him. But he was one of these guys that would say, there's got to be a law that says this, that just logically there's got to be something that says this, and that's the way he would do his research. He'd look for what or I'd do it for him. But he was quite a guy. He died too young. That was the only problem.
When he came back, he started with Mr. Thrasher, and then what was the genealogy of Wright in Hampton?
He was with Thrasher for quite a while. And then he opened up by himself. And in the Fenton building, and I don't know what floor in the Fenton building, in 1921. And K.T. Johnson came with him. When K.T. graduated from Michigan Law School, he was with him. And then Bill Fletcher was with him, a guy named Bill Fletcher, who became president of Empire State Mutual Life Insurance Company. And then eventually Art Laudenschlager came with him, did his property work for him. And I think that's the only other people that I know of that I can remember that were with him.
And Bob came back?
Then Bob came back in 1947. And Bud came back in '52, and I came back in '54.
Terrific. Now, during that time, did your dad interface much with Bob Jackson?
I frankly don't know.
Yeah.
I really don't know, Greg. You see, Jackson was born in 1892, and my dad was born in '95, so he was just a few years older. And my dad started practicing in 1921. And I assume that Jackson, I think, went to Albany Law School, didn't he?
For a year.
For a year? Then he must have done
He
it
did, just
under
like
private practice,
Right.
too. I wonder who he...
Frank Mott.
Frank Mott? Okay, I'm with you. I know the name. And so they must have practiced together. You see... Jackson, I don't know when Jackson went to Washington, but he became Solicitor General, and I think in 1938.
Sounds about right.
But whether he went to Washington before that time or not, I don't know.
He was in the tax department in kind of the early 30s, shortly after Roosevelt went to Washington. Jackson's career closely followed Roosevelt's.
And I guess during the early years, a lot of his practice was centered around the legality of some of Roosevelt's New Deal laws and so forth.
Did you ever meet Jackson?
Yeah, well, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I did. But most of it, you see, I say I knew Bob Jackson. Well, that's nonsense. I was a kid then,
Sure.
Bob Jackson, of course, lived down on the corner of Hanford and 394 down there, the Lakewood Road. And we moved from Meadow Lane, where across from the Fairmount School there, we moved up in Broadview, where Bill lives now, on Warwick Road, in 1932, when I was 4 years old. And as I grew up, we all played at Goodell's, where Charlie Goodell lived. John and Charlie and Bill and George and all the Goodell boys down there. And the Goodell's, that was where all the kids gathered. And I don't ever remember that Bill Jackson, I think he was probably older I know he was a lot older than I was, but older than the kids that played down there. But as I told you on the telephone, I remember as a kid going down to Jackson's, and they had two garages in back. Once where they kept their car, and then there was another, like a storage garage down there, and that's where Bill Jackson kept his Model A truck. And I'd go down there as a kid and look at that truck, and just, it was a gorgeous truck, I'll tell you. But we played in the neighborhood, as I say, down there. And then when the Jacksons left and went to Washington, the Niebanks moved in that house down there. And Mr. Niebank, I think he was a state banking examiner, if I'm not mistaken. They lived somewhere down near Rochester, because they had a summer place on Canisius Lake. And I remember the Niebank boys always going back to Canisius Lake to visit friends back there. And so when they moved into that house down there, of course, we'd go down and stay overnight with the Niebank boys down there, and it was a gorgeous home, that Jackson home, probably still is, but big living room, I remember, and a music room, and a big formal dining room, and the kitchen was in the back, and then they had a sleeping porch up over the kitchen. So we'd go down there. It was always a great treat to sleep out on that sleeping porch as kids, you know. And then when the Niebank boys grew up, they went up and bought a place up on Westminster Drive. And of course, we were still very close to the Niebank boys at that time. And then I assumed the Jackson house was sold at that time. I don't know when the Niebanks moved.
Sure. You might have Miles come in too.
Yeah, wonderful.
Bring him on.
Yeah.
Terrific.
But when as I say, when the Jackson place was sold down there, I assume it was sold. I have no idea to whom it was sold to. But then Mr. Jackson would come and visit the Niebanks, and he would come to our house, and Bob and Irene Jackson, Mrs. Jackson's name was Irene. They were friends of my parents.
Yeah.
But I never knew them personally. I remember I mentioned to you once before that Jackson rode up one time on a bicycle. The Niebanks, and they had the kids' bicycles, and they rode up and sat on the front porch and talked to my parents. Hi, Miles.
How are you?
Fine. Nice to see you.
Greg, good to see you.
We're having too much fun here. Have a seat.
Oh,
Well, isn't this great to be able to shed the tie and go out in the sweater and?
I never thought I could. Well, I was theoretically working across the street, but
Good for you.
Sheldon Foundation.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I never thought I could come to an office without a tie,
It's great.
jacket. I still try to wear one when I know people are coming in to see me, but
Yeah.
otherwise,
Yeah.
We're in the process of having.
Yeah.
Bill told me a little bit about Bob Jackson.
yeah. I'm sorry. Go
No.
on.
No,
Glad you came.
Yeah, I'm interested myself. Okay, go ahead.
but I was just saying to Greg that when, of course, they were great friends of the Niebanks, you know, George Niebank, and of course they were neighbors.
Yep.
And I remember sitting on the front porch with my father back, which I assume was, you know, in the 40s or early 50s, when Jackson came riding up the driveway one day with Mr. Niebank on the kids' bicycles, on the two-wheelers, you know, and they
Yeah.
rode up and sit on the front porch and talk. But that's about the only connection I ever had with Jackson.
You were at the funeral?
Yep, I was at the funeral. I drove in the funeral.
Tell me about that.
Well, I graduated from law school in June of '54, and I was waiting to hear from the bar exam. I took the bar exam, I remember, on June the 30th and July the 1st of '54, and I was waiting to hear on the bar exam. And he died in the summer of '54, as I recall, or maybe September or something like that.
October, yeah.
October '54. And I was waiting to hear, as I say, from the bar exam. And when he died, they picked a group of young lawyers to drive in the funeral. And I was one of them. I think Sherry probably drove. I know my brother Bud drove one of the cars. And I had as my guests in the car Tom Clark and Minton, and I think Burton. I think there was a Judge Burton, if I'm not
Yeah.
mistaken. Wasn't there a Minton also?
Yes,
And those are the three that I had:
Right.
Tom Clark, Minton, and Burton. Real nice guys. Tom Clark was, I think he was a former Attorney General, if I'm not mistaken, and he was the friendliest of all of them, you know. And we got to talking, and I told him that I had recently taken the bar exam. And, of course, he wished me luck and all of that, and said, you know, you ought to come down and be sworn in before the Supreme Court when you get admitted. And I said, yeah, I would do that, you know. But and I did, but it was much later. I think it was the early '60s. I went down, and of course, the whole court had changed by that time. But I remember driving around Chautauqua Lake, and they wanted to see Chautauqua. And Charlie McCluskey, I believe, was the sheriff at that time. And he led the whole procession in the sheriff's car, and we had all of the justices in a big long line, and all drove all through Chautauqua and around the lake and so forth. And then, of course, the burial was down in Bruceburg.
Mhm.
Have you ever been down to see the
Never have,
stone?
no.
Well, I could take you to it sometime.
I'd love to.
I'm sure Bill Cass could too. But that was quite an experience. And I remember they all went to Moonbrook for lunch.
Mhm.
And I think I mentioned to you that K.T. Johnson, I don't know if he was the president of Moonbrook at the time, but he got them all to autograph their pictures and so forth. And that was up at Moonbrook on the wall up there for many years
Mhm.
after. And I think it's the same one that appears on the wall down in the office now, down in the Bank of Jamestown building.
That's one of Jackson's. That's a little bit earlier though. That's when Harlan Stone
Yeah.
was the chief
Yeah.
judge.
Well, Frankfurter, I remember he came too. He was a little guy. But I don't remember the other names, and I should, but I just don't remember who the other.
Earl Warren must have stood up.
I think he came later.
Yeah, he did. Well, Miles has a great story, and I hate that.
No.
I'll continue with you, Bill, but
No.
Miles' story will conclude all of this here nicely. How did it work logistically? I'm curious. The Supreme Court justices come up from Washington to Warren? Is that what happened? You go?
I assumed I know there was a direct rail
Yeah.
line.
Well, let's segue. Oh, go ahead.
And the reason I know that is my dad was on the War Labor Board during World War II.
Mhm.
And we would take him to Warren, and he would catch the train from Warren directly to Washington without take that sleeper train at night. So.
Then you were asked, and did you pick up the justices going to the church, or were you take them from the church to, what do you call that piece of the puzzle?
I don't.
Okay.
I don't. I remember driving him to the cemetery.
Mhm.
Now, whether we picked him up at Moonbrook and drove him to the cemetery, well, no, I know we drove
gone
him
from
around
the
the
church,
lake.
yeah.
We drove him around the lake, but I don't remember where we picked him up, whether it was the airport or where it was.
Did you, so you had them a couple times. Did you have the same judges on each trip? For example, going to the cemetery
As I recall, I did.
and then around the lake as well?
As I recall, we took the same car.
You must have been a hot ticket. Not everybody had a chance to drive the justices.
That's
huh?
right.
Got that right.
I got to tell you, just one quick vignette. John Goodell was in here, and I talked to John.
Yeah.
And John was a pallbearer.
Yep.
And I was asking him about being a pallbearer, and he said, the only thing, as I'm carrying the casket, the 8 of us, is it was rough ground down there at Frewsburg.
Yep, I remember that too.
And he said, the thing that passes through your mind, and it's amazing for my classics class, is how when you were the pallbearer for a pharaoh, and if you were to stumble, they would immediately cut off your head. And I'm looking at the ground, I'm seeing how rough it is, and I'm pressured not to let this thing stumble.
Oh, gee. Isn't that some? Who were the other pallbearers? Do you recall that? Did John remember?
He didn't.
Yeah.
I imagine the paper might say, but.
You know, you don't have the Supreme Court reporter here, do you? Well, in our office, we took him for a number of years, and you could always find, depending on the year, you could open up the cover, and it always told who the justices were at that particular time. But I don't recall beside Frankfurter, and I don't think Warren was on the court yet. If he was he on the court at that time? Okay.
That's what my
Yeah.
story is going to
Earl
be.
Warren?
It-
Yeah.